The first two installments of this series analyzed two of my absolute favorite levels in Bloodborne, the haunting rural village of Hemwick Charnel Lane, and the triumph of interwoven level design in central Yarnum. So I thought, you know what, why not challenge myself a bit? Why not tackle a level that's not near the top of my list, but really closer towards the bottom? And surprisingly to me, I actually got several requests to examine this level in the comments of those other videos. Unsurprisingly to me, there's a whole lot going on in this area, as it's one of the most sprawling regions in the entire game, and one of the most pivotal in your journey as far as uncovering the narrative goes. The Forbidden Woods has the ability to both haunt and delight players who enter its secretive setting, and inevitably get lost in its murky, amorphous environment. It also features two of the most drastically different subsections in its village and forest areas, but uses both expertly to steadily establish its theme of a disorienting journey away from the limits of Yarnum as the player begins to unravel the true significance behind Bloodborne's story. It's that choice to create the Forbidden Woods with deliberately confusing design that ends up being its most defining and most polarizing feature. And it's a feature that sparks a debate not just about level design, but about the desired intentions that developers have for their games, and how much players should be willing to endure to accept those intentions. So in this breakdown, we'll take a look at how this style of design is implemented, how it steadily grows throughout the course of the level, and how it impacts both what the player experiences and the emotions they feel. This is the level design of Bloodborne, the Forbidden Woods. Okay, first some housekeeping items. Just like I established in the previous video, the goal of this series is not to exhaustively cover every detail of a level's layout, environment, and lore, but rather to examine the concepts and design elements that best characterize each area of Bloodborne as unique spaces. In other words, what are the standout features of each level that make it special? If you're more interested in that former style of breakdown, I have an ongoing series on the design of Central Yarnum you can find for free over on Patreon. That series covers step-by-step each section of that level, including design choices like layout and structure, enemy placement, environmental communication, and more. When it comes to the Forbidden Woods in particular, identifying its most defining characteristics means speaking of its design more broadly, especially considering the sheer scale of the level relative to the scope of this video. Plus, I think the most interesting discussions of this level are a direct result of the emotions it forces upon the player rather than any specific area or encounter it presents, but more on that later. Speaking of scope, the Forbidden Woods is one of the largest regions in the game, full of open design, multiple paths, and entangled connections to other spaces. Though at first I attempted to put together a script that concisely analyzed the level as a whole, that task proved a little too difficult, as there's just a lot to discuss here. So instead, I'm splitting this video into two parts. The first focusing on the introduction to the region and its first subsection, and the second continuing into the latter half of the level before tackling some broader, more philosophical questions about the level's design, and how those design choices can impact the player both positively and negatively. The Forbidden Woods is an area that we're made aware of during our time in the Cathedral Ward. As it's brought to our attention, we'll need to cross through it in order to get to our real goal, the legendary College of Byrgenwerth.
But today, the college lies deep within a tangled wood, abandoned and decrepit.
And while we don't know exactly what we'll find at Byrgenwerth, it's made clear that this will be a pivotal location in the story of Bloodborne. As such, it's apparent that FromSoft wanted the discovery of Byrgenwerth to feel significant, and in order to do this, they devised a dastardly level that we have to fully traverse before making that discovery and stumbling upon our eye-opening destination. The Forbidden Woods is the result of that process. A massive, winding, dark, dangerous, and deliberately disorienting region unlike most environments we've seen up to this point. Its daunting path takes the player further and further away from the more normal, if you can call it that, version of Yarnum that we've been introduced to so far. Of course, it's been weird battling the beastly villagers of Central Yarnum and the ghostly keepers of the Cathedral Ward, but in the Forbidden Woods we begin the gradual transition from weird to truly bizarre. And by the time we reach Byrgenwerth, we find ourselves in the middle of a narrative and atmosphere that most players likely wouldn't have predicted through the first couple levels of the game. This region of Bloodborne is effectively split into two subsections that I'll be referring to as the Village and the Woods. Both are distinct in their core premises while still feeling like they're part of the same level, making the Forbidden Woods feel like a collision of contrast and cohesion. Because while the atmosphere, tone, and aesthetic are consistent throughout both sections, The layout and structure of each create two significantly unique experiences for the player, and both come together to create one of Bloodborne's most infamously polarizing levels. The atmosphere and mood found throughout the Forbidden Woods are actually not established immediately, but rather the level takes the opportunity to use a transitional area to guide the player into its core and the dangers found within it. After unlocking the password-protected door in the Cathedral Ward, the player makes their way down a narrow path, down and away from familiar areas, and soon down into the depths of our mysteriously dark wooded destination. And on the edge of this transitional area is the last safe space we'll encounter for a while, as we see the familiar glow of a lantern propped up in front of a surely abandoned windmill hut. This location was one of the single most impactful spaces in the entire game for me. Its locked door prevents us from seeing what's inside for now, but its placement is so prominent we can already conclude that opening this door from the other side will almost certainly be the result of one of the world's shortcuts. The only question is, where is the origin of this shortcut, and how far do we have to travel to get there? We'll get to that later, but for now, it's time to cross through the proper entrance to the Forbidden Woods, the short bridge to our left that leads directly into darkness. Though not exactly bright and chipper environments in their own right, previous areas in the game like Central Yharnam and the Cathedral Ward did at least utilize open skyboxes providing some sense of light and direction. But the opening bridge into the Forbidden Woods makes it clear that we will no longer be afforded such comforts, and instead we'll have to trust that our instincts will be enough to navigate the path forward. Oh, and in case it wasn't plain enough that this bridge marks a very clear point of separation into a dangerous area, there's always the immediate trap in the middle of your pathway that has the very high potential to send you flying to your death to serve that purpose as well. It doesn't take long after crossing this ravine for the Forbidden Woods to expose the player to its more open style of design, because while there certainly appears to be a main path leading you directly into your next enemy encounter, we're also given the option to veer off to the less structured high ground where we can strategically pick off the enemies below. Or you can just keep running along this high ground to avoid the encounter altogether. But the choices don't end with this encounter, because after this we're really given a glimpse of one of the defining features of the Forbidden Woods, a deliberately confusing and visually disorienting space with multiple paths to exit. The upcoming village actually has 3 separate points of entry from this direction, none of which are visible from any vantage point we've had so far. As we look across the grassy hill, the dark lighting and lack of open sightlines invokes a feeling of unease that slowly begins to chip away at any sense of confidence the player may have had up to this point. Certainly, previous areas in the game have contained multiple pathways and branching choices for traversing their environments. In fact, that's typically one of the key components of FromSoft's level design overall. But as with most design concepts, there's nuance here, and this area preceding the village begins to show us how this design philosophy can be bent in a way to disorient the player. Our visual reference points here are no longer prominent landmarks like a towering cathedral or a brightly lit boulevard, but rather subtle shifts in the topography and an occasional source of light. All of these choices come together to form an unassuming section of the level that causes the player to become quite unsure of where their decisions will lead them. In reality, there's not necessarily a correct or incorrect way to go here, and eventually we'll find our way to the village down the hill no matter what. But the presence of open design elements that create multiple choices begin to imprint upon the player the level's overarching theme of puzzling entanglement. Depending which path you decide to take, or are accidentally forced into, will determine where you enter the village from. And while the village itself is set up in a seemingly normal layout, it consists mainly of several similar-looking buildings you can enter, some with a clear purpose and some more cloudy in their motives, some containing items and some housing enemies. But as the explorer in all of us wants to check out each of these residences, we begin to get a bit turned around. Did I enter this building already? What direction did I come from? Was I just on this side of the village or that one? Questions like this work to slowly fill the player's mind with uncertainty, poking at our ability to remain vigilant. Caution begins to give way to confusion. Deliberateness is replaced with distraction. Both Bloodborne and FromSoft games in general utilize disorientation like this extremely effectively, but in the Forbidden Woods, this tactic is taken to a higher level. And as we'll see later, this is really only the beginning. In fact, the village section of this region almost serves as a primer or warm-up for what the player will ultimately encounter later on in the level. As we continue to clear out the village and finally catch our bearings a bit, we'll find there's much more here than meets the eye, including an upper gated entrance and some dog kennels, a system of rooftops and slapped together wooden bridges, and a swampy lower path that ultimately leads to our escape from this section of the level. What initially seemed like a short detour on our journey through the woods turns out to be a fully fleshed out area that's no less delicately crafted than any other in the game. Careful exploration reveals a minor but useful shortcut through a back door in one of the homes, and even a hidden side path that will have you reminiscing of the meticulously intertwined world design of Dark Souls. It takes quite a bit of time to thoroughly uncover everything here, though it's important to mention that no matter how thorough we are, we'll find no second lamp. Instead, we're forced to move on without knowing what our next point of safety will be. And as we leave the main village, we're presented with one of the few clear linear paths found in the entire level, flanked by enemies and houses on both sides, and a wacky concluding encounter with a cannon for some reason. Regardless, it's here we finally regain some confidence in our path forward, providing just a bit of relief after what was likely several attempts of wandering through and attempting to map out the preceding village area. And what are we rewarded with? A dark, spooky indoor section with some creepy-ass snake-headed enemies. And it's this precise encounter where the entire mood of the Forbidden Woods, and really the narrative of Bloodborne overall, takes that sharp but fascinating turn towards the truly bizarre. If you've followed this channel at all, you know that quality pacing is one of the most important aspects of a game for me, including pacing that's developed through introducing new enemies at intentional points throughout the flow of a game. Conveniently, that's partly what's happening here, but this change in form, which is further developed in the next section of the level, is more than just a method to introduce variety in combat. It's an entire shift in atmosphere and narrative. From this point on in Bloodborne, our character will no longer be surrendering their time to smaller fish like pitchfork-wielding Yarnamites. Instead, they'll be tackling celestial centipedes and chime maidens and abandoned luncheonettes. The enemy variety introduced moving forward is a byproduct of the narrative and its demand for more otherworldly themes. Up until now, our entire journey has been about seeking a way to end the hunt, a concept that most players likely took at face value, associating the hunt with the more animal-like manifestations of the many once human enemies found throughout Yharnam. And through our time with the game so far, we've encountered a whole spectrum of these beasts, some of which have had their humanity aggressively torn from their very being, and others who are sadly only beginning that heartbreaking transition. Even throughout the Cathedral Ward, a region that drops a few unexplained encounters in our laps, the church servants and chapel giants patrolling its plazas are mostly human-like in stature. And admittedly, so is this guy right here. Until he's not. Similarly, the entire world we've so far been exposed to has been carefully presented to us as one specific reality. Until it's not. As we traverse the Forbidden Woods and make our way closer and closer to Byrgenwerth, we slowly become more exposed to the sources behind Bloodborne's greater story, as well as the truth about this affliction that has been dehumanizing the residents of Yharnam. And getting closer and closer to Byrgenwerth, of course, means getting further and further from the city of Yharnam, away from its streets and structures that, although crawling with their own dangers, still maintained some sense of normalcy and familiarity. But the first half of the Forbidden Woods serves to slowly transition the player away from those senses, introducing them to the darkness of the woods and the mysteries that lie beyond them. The village found in this half of the region acts as a connector from city to wilderness, and it's the last we'll see of these familiar foes who inhabit Yharnam. Because as we travel deeper into the woods, we reach a point where even the bloodthirsty Yarnamites won't venture to, and our path instead becomes inhabited by creatures of an even more sinister nature and an environment even more entangled than the last. But this transition isn't sudden or even immediately noticeable. Instead, it's subtly managed by design that both distracts and intrigues us, just enough that by the time we reach the second half of the level, all hope of normalcy has already vanished into the thick canopy above. And we've been so focused on surviving as we continue to push forward and away that we don't even realize that all we've done is driven ourselves further into darkness and dropped ourselves directly into a place that's one of the most isolating, most disorienting, and most fiercely debated in all of Bloodborne. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw here, be sure to keep an eye out for part 2 of this breakdown that will be focused on what is almost certainly the more divisive half of this level. I mean, where the fuck even am I right now? In the meantime, you can check out the other videos so far in this series, or leave a like and comment here letting me know which area of Bloodborne you'd like to see me cover next. See you next time.